Lord Adair Turner, thank you very much for joining us here at the Fung Global Institute. Let me talk to you about your new role and your transition into a new book. You say it's about capitalism, so where are we now with capitalism?
Well, I think the market economy, capitalism, has proved the best mechanism we have for delivering prosperity. It has delivered huge prosperity in the developed world, and increasingly a number of countries in the emerging market are making the breakthrough to middle income at least levels. And of course, China's success, it wouldn't describe it as a capitalist economy, or it would describe it as probably capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics or some other interesting combination of words, but it's clearly a market economy in many aspects, and it has many of the aspects of private capital motivations. So it's at one level an extraordinarily successful system, but there are major issues about it. One of which is the extreme increase in inequality which is occurring in many developed and developing countries, which I think we need to understand and offset, because otherwise we will undermine the legitimacy of this system. We also know that the finance aspects of capitalism are sources of huge instability, which I believe are avoidable instability. We can avoid them, but they are self-inflicted wounds. And there are very major issues about how capitalism, the market economy, and growth left to itself will damage the environment. So there are, within the basic context of the fact that market economies clearly succeeded compared with planned economies, there are very major questions that we've got to ask about how well capitalism going forward will serve the needs of humanity, and how we have to regulate, control, augment and complement it to make sure that it does so.
So here we are in Hong Kong talking about an East-West partnership, a dialogue between the two regions. What can we here in Asia learn from what's happened in the West?
Well, I think one of the main things to learn for emerging markets in Asia or elsewhere is to avoid some of the completely unnecessary financial instability which we allowed to occur in the West by falling in love with some intellectual delusions about the nature of finance capitalism. Finance is very different from other sectors of the economy. I mean, essentially, if you want good restaurants, there's no better formula than a completely free market. You know, some will fail, some will succeed, some will manage to develop new styles, new ambiances, new menus that satisfy consumer expectations. Any attempt to plan or regulate it, other than in health and safety fashions, just doesn't really help at all. Finance is different. There's some things about the nature of finance, and particularly about when finance creates debt instruments in excessive quantities, which can create risks, which can create unnecessary, what economists call rent extraction, people essentially making lots of money from activities which are not socially useful, they're not a useful part of the market economy. And we failed to realize that in the developed worlds before the financial crisis. We fell in love with economic theories which believed that you could apply completely free market principles to finance as to any other sector of the economy. And that was a major intellectual delusion, and one needs to be very careful of it. Finance needs very careful regulation, and in particular, the processes of banking and credit creation need very careful regulation and control. So
what are the cautions, what are the measures you think that Asia can put in place? Because obviously in India we're seeing still very strong growth, China still very strong growth, Southeast Asia as well, Indonesia in particular. The temptation is to obviously open the markets up, open them up very rapidly. What could Asia do to exercise caution?
Well, I think in relation to financial liberalization, there is a case for financial liberalization, in particular in things which help the provision of basic banking services. For instance, in India, I think there would be a value in the extension of banking services into the villages, into the SMEs, a real extension of financial products to the mass market. But one needs to be careful about financial liberalization. And I actually think the Chinese authorities and the Indian authorities have a very sensible approach of saying, we're not just going to open the floodgates and immediately buy all of the ideas of financial derivatives and trading and total liberalization. We'll go step by step and we'll see what works. Because, as I said, finance is an area where it's not as simple as saying simply liberalizing. You have to be cautious. The other thing, which of course is something that in the West we can learn from what countries in the East have already been doing, is the containment of unnecessary, potentially harmful real estate booms. I mean, here in Hong Kong, Hong Kong has been applying for many years things like loan-to-value limits, ways of slowing down property price booms, which we decided 30 years ago were old-fashioned and unnecessary and unreasonable limitations of the free market. And actually we're realizing that you and the Chinese and the Indians, for instance, through reserve requirement systems, have been applying some tools that maybe we need to think again about.
Let's talk about GDP then, because one of the things here that we're talking about is coming up with new models of growth. You've mentioned GDP before as not the best way to measure growth and success, and that particularly applies in this part of the world. Could you maybe explain that and what new model you would come up with?
Well, I think when you look at GDP as a measure of growth, it has all sorts of statistical imperfections. But even more fundamentally, there's quite a lot of evidence that as people get richer, as economies get richer in average GDP per capita, average income per person, it makes a lot of difference when you go from $1,000 a year to $10,000 a year to $15,000 a year. The transition, which for instance China is on at the moment, of becoming a middle-income economy. But once you get to 25,000, the evidence of the last 30 years is that it's not fundamentally transformational to human welfare, because people are getting to some level of satiation in basic needs. And you enter an economy where a lot of consumption is not about things that could possibly make you permanently happier. They're ways of competing for status with one another, buying a fashion good because, you have to have it because everybody else is needs it. Now, what we need to therefore realize is that we get to a point where further growth in GDP per capita should not be the absolute overriding objective. I think there's nothing wrong with it. I think it will tend to happen as a byproduct of other good things in the economy, things like innovation and creativity. But I think once you get to those high levels, the levels that the developed world have got to, we should see growth as the byproduct of other things that we want in themselves, rather than the be-all and end-all where it's desperately important to increase the rate of growth from 2 to 2.5%. It's just not all that important. The other thing to say, though, is that alongside the growth, it's very important to look at the distribution of growth. And if you look, America is the most extreme version of this. Despite a growing economy over the last 25 years, a lot of ordinary Americans in the bottom half of the distribution of income have not received an increase in their real income for several decades. And that's really quite stunning. All of the benefits have gone to the top 10%, and the vast majority of the benefits to the top 1% or so of the population. That's a real break in the sort of American dream of everybody participating in increased prosperity. And I think we need to ask very searching questions about why that has occurred, because it's that increase in inequality which has two aspects. It involves the bottom of the income distribution falling away from the middle, but also the top of the income distribution moving way away from the middle as well. And those are things that, as economists, we only imperfectly understand. But I don't think we can simply accept them and could be completely relaxed about them, because they will both corrode the ability of the market economy to deliver higher welfare, but they will also undermine political support for the market economy over time.
Lord Adair Turner, thank you very much for talking to us here at the Fund Global Institute.
Thank you.